The bitter March wind howled across the Yorkshire countryside, whipping around the Duke of Westmoreland's carriage as it lurched along the muddy road toward his newest acquisition. Lord James Blackwood sat rigid inside, his face an impassive mask that had become his standard expression in the 7 years since his beloved wife's death. The weathered stone farmhouse came into view through the rain-streaked window, its dilapidated condition even more apparent than when he had purchased it weeks earlier. The Duke had bought the abandoned property without much thought, merely another parcel to add to his vast holdings, but something about its neglected grandeur had stirred an unexpected feeling in him. Perhaps it was because it reminded him of himself, once magnificent, now hollow and forgotten by time. As the carriage halted before the house, the Duke's sharp eyes caught an impossible sight. Warm light flickered behind windows that should have been empty and dark. The property had been abandoned for years, the previous owners long bankrupt, yet unmistakable signs of habitation confronted him. Smoke curled from the chimney, rising defiantly into the grey sky. A small, well-tended vegetable garden had been freshly planted alongside the eastern wall, and laundry hung from a line stretched between two ancient oak trees. The Duke's expression darkened as his long fingers curled into a fist. Someone had taken possession of his property, a trespass he would not tolerate. With purposeful strides that sent gravel scattering, Lord Blackwood approached the door of his property, his tall frame casting an intimidating shadow. Before he could pound his fist against the weathered wood, the door creaked open, revealing a young woman whose appearance momentarily startled him. She stood straight-backed despite her simple, well-worn dress, with intelligent brown eyes that met his without wavering. Behind her, an elderly woman sat by the fire, her frail hands clutching a shawl around her thin shoulders. Neither woman cowered at the sight of the notorious Duke, whose cold demeanor had sent countless society ladies retreating in fear. The abandoned Blackwood farm had not been abandoned after all. Eleanor Reed had discovered the deteriorating house 6 weeks earlier, while searching desperately for shelter after being evicted from their modest London apartment following her father's death. Professor Reed had left behind nothing but debts and a trunk of old documents that suggested this very property had once belonged to Eleanor's grandfather before being unjustly seized during a time of financial hardship. With nowhere else to go and her elderly Aunt Margaret growing weaker by the day, Eleanor had made the bold decision to claim what she believed might rightfully be hers, pouring every last penny into making one corner of the vast house habitable. The Duke's fury was immediate and absolute. This slip of a woman had dared to trespass on his land, to take possession of his property without permission or right. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of his title and the authority of a man unaccustomed to being defied. Yet something in Eleanor's steady gaze gave him pause, not fear or deference, but a quiet dignity that seemed oddly familiar. It reminded him of Catherine, his late wife, whose gentle strength had been the only force capable of softening his rigid nature. The comparison unsettled him deeply, causing words to catch in his throat as thunder suddenly crashed overhead. The heavens opened without warning, unleashing a deluge that instantly transformed the driveway into a river of mud. The Duke's carriage driver shouted over the downpour that the road back to Westmoreland Manor had already flooded. They would not make it back before nightfall. The storm had made its decision. Lord James Blackwood, the most formidable duke in the county, would be forced to seek shelter beneath his own roof, now occupied by two women who, by all rights, should never have crossed paths with a man of his station. Neither the Duke nor Eleanor could have imagined how this unexpected imprisonment would alter the course of their lives forever. 14 years earlier, Eleanor Reed had been the cherished only child of Professor William Reed, a respected scholar whose brilliant mind had earned him a modest position at Oxford University. Though they lacked the wealth and connections of the aristocracy, Eleanor's childhood had been rich in knowledge and secure in affection. Her father had educated her as he would have a son, teaching her languages, mathematics, and philosophy, subjects considered entirely inappropriate for a young lady's delicate constitution. While other girls practiced needlepoint and the pianoforte, Eleanor had devoured ancient texts and debated political theory with her father's colleagues. This unconventional upbringing had shaped her into a woman who valued substance over status, yet it had done little to prepare her for the harsh realities that followed her father's sudden death from pneumonia. The revelation that Professor Reed had borrowed heavily against his modest salary to fund his research had come as a devastating shock, as had the swift appearance of creditors who seized everything of value, leaving Eleanor and her father's widowed sister, Margaret, entirely destitute. Society offered few options for a well-educated but penniless young woman. Eleanor had tried working as a governess, but her refusal to teach young ladies only the superficial accomplishments expected of them had resulted in dismissal after dismissal. With each passing month, Aunt Margaret's health had deteriorated, and desperation had driven Eleanor to search through her father's remaining papers for anything that might help their situation. Among the scholarly notes and correspondence, she had discovered a yellowed deed and letters suggesting her grandfather had once owned a prosperous farm in Yorkshire, a property that appeared to have been taken through questionable means during a financial crisis decades ago. The discovery had planted a seed of hope in Eleanor's heart, a dangerous hope that had led her to gather their few remaining possessions and journey north with her ailing aunt to find this forgotten family property. What Eleanor could not have known was that Lord James Blackwood had purchased the abandoned farm merely 6 weeks before her arrival. The Duke of Westmoreland was a man whose life had been defined by rigid adherence to duty and propriety since inheriting his title at the young age of 23. His brief marriage to Lady Catherine Armstrong had been the only period of true happiness in his otherwise austere existence. Her death during childbirth, along with that of their infant son, had left him with a heart encased in ice and a distrust of emotional attachments that manifested as cold arrogance. In the 7 years since her passing, Lord Blackwood had expanded his already considerable estate, managed his business interests with ruthless efficiency, and rebuffed every attempt by ambitious mothers to secure him as a husband for their daughters. The rainstorm that trapped the Duke at Blackwood Farm created an unprecedented situation. His driver and footman were accommodated in the stable, while propriety demanded that Lord Blackwood himself remain in the main house, despite the impropriety of sharing quarters with 2 unrelated women without servants or chaperones. Eleanor had surrendered the one habitable bedroom to her aunt and offered the Duke the small study, where she had been sleeping, preparing to make do with a chair by the fire. His grudging acceptance had come with the declaration that he would depart at first light and expected them to vacate his property within the week, regardless of their claims or circumstances. As thunder continued to shake the ancient walls of Blackwood Farm, neither the proud Duke nor the determined young woman could have anticipated how this night would fundamentally alter both their carefully constructed worlds. Eleanor's quiet dignity in the face of adversity and her selfless care for her aunt had already begun to stir something long dormant in Lord Blackwood's frozen heart, while his unexpected vulnerability, when speaking of his late wife, had given Eleanor a glimpse of the man beneath the ducal facade. Morning would bring difficult confrontations and revelations, but for now, the storm had forced an uneasy truce between the rightful owner and the desperate occupant of the old stone house that stood weathering the elements as it had for centuries. The storm that had trapped them together lasted not 1 night but 3, transforming Blackwood Farm into an isolated island amid flooded fields and impassable roads. During those days of forced proximity, the Duke witnessed Eleanor's remarkable resourcefulness as she prepared simple but nourishing meals from her modest stores, tended to her aunt's persistent cough with herbal remedies gathered from the overgrown garden, and continued her efforts to make the dilapidated house more habitable. Her hands, he noticed, were not the soft ornamental appendages of a lady of leisure, but capable instruments that could build a fire, mend a leaking roof, and still turn the pages of the worn volume of Shakespeare she read aloud to her aunt each evening. Most striking to Lord Blackwood was Eleanor's unwavering dignity. She neither apologized for her circumstances nor sought his pity, treating him not as a duke to be flattered and feared, but simply as another human being sheltering from the same storm. This novel experience both unsettled and intrigued a man accustomed to the artificial deference his title automatically commanded. On the 3rd evening, as wind still howled around the ancient stone walls, Lord Blackwood found himself drawn to the kitchen, where Eleanor worked alone, her aunt having retired early. Something about her solitary figure illuminated by candlelight as she carefully counted out their dwindling tea leaves, stirred an unfamiliar impulse in him. For the first time in years, he felt compelled to explain himself to another person, to make this particular woman understand he was not merely the cold aristocrat she surely perceived. Words he had not intended to speak formed on his lips, revealing how he had purchased Blackwood Farm not for its value, but because something about its abandoned dignity had reminded him of the estate where he had spent rare, happy moments with Catherine before duty called him back to London. He spoke of his late wife's love for simple country pleasures, so at odds with the formal grandeur expected of a duchess, and how her death had left him convinced that anything of beauty in his life was destined to be taken from him. Eleanor had listened without interruption, her expressive eyes reflecting understanding rather than the pity he had learned to despise. When she finally spoke, her response was not what anyone in his social circle would have dared offer, gentle but unflinching truth. She suggested that by surrounding himself with only the cold trappings of his position and rejecting emotional connections, he'd been ensuring the fulfillment of his own bleak prophecy. No one would take beauty from his life if he refused to allow any in. Her words, delivered without accusation but with the quiet conviction of someone who had faced her own profound losses, penetrated defenses Lord Blackwood had maintained for 7 years. That night, as he retired to the small study that served as his temporary chamber, the Duke found himself contemplating not how quickly he could remove these women from his property, but whether Eleanor's claim to the farm might have legitimacy worth investigating. The skies finally cleared on the 4th day, allowing Lord Blackwood's carriage to navigate the still muddy roads back to Westmoreland Manor. Before departing, he had surprised himself by extending the women's tenancy for 2 additional weeks, while he examined the documents Eleanor had hesitantly shown him. Fragile papers suggesting her grandfather had indeed owned the property before losing it under questionable circumstances to creditors with connections to the previous lord of the manor. He had also, in a gesture that confused his own driver, arranged for provisions to be delivered to Blackwood Farm and instructed his personal physician to call upon the ailing Aunt Margaret. These actions, he told himself, were merely the obligation of a gentleman toward ladies in distress, and had nothing to do with the curious lightening he had felt in his chest when Eleanor had smiled her genuine thanks, a smile utterly unlike the practiced simpers he received in London ballrooms. Back at magnificent Westmoreland Manor, surrounded by the opulent furnishings and attentive servants that reflected his exalted position, Lord Blackwood found himself restless in a way he had not experienced since the early days of his grief. His library, once a sanctuary, now seemed oppressively silent compared to the simple kitchen at Blackwood Farm, where Eleanor's voice had brought Shakespeare's words to life. His meals, expertly prepared by a French chef, lacked the simple satisfaction of the hearty stew Eleanor had served in chipped bowls. Most disturbing of all was his growing preoccupation with proving the legitimacy of Eleanor's claim to the property he had purchased, a matter he assigned to his solicitor with unusual urgency. As days passed, the Duke found himself inventing reasons to return to Blackwood Farm, each visit revealing more about the extraordinary young woman whose intelligence and fortitude increasingly commanded his respect and stirred emotions he had believed long dead. The transformation in Eleanor's circumstances over the following weeks was nothing short of remarkable. The Duke's intervention had brought not only a steady supply of food and firewood to Blackwood Farm, but also medical care that had significantly improved Aunt Margaret's condition. The elderly woman now sat comfortably by windows that had been properly repaired by workers sent from the Duke's estate, wrapped in warm blankets that had mysteriously appeared one afternoon. Even more surprising were Lord Blackwood's increasingly frequent visits, ostensibly to discuss the progress of his solicitor's investigation into the property's history, but lingering well beyond what such conversations required. Eleanor found herself both grateful for and unsettled by these attentions. Each small comfort eased their desperate situation, yet she could not forget that their future remained entirely at the mercy of a man whose world was so far removed from her own. The temporary nature of their reprieve was emphasized by the occasional carriage that brought visitors from neighboring estates, curious about the Duke's interest in the previously abandoned farm and its unusual occupants. Among these visitors was Lady Victoria Sheffield, The Duke's cousin, whose narrowed gaze and thinly veiled contempt made it abundantly clear she considered Eleanor an upstart who needed to be firmly put in her place. One particularly fine April afternoon, the Duke arrived unannounced as Eleanor worked in the garden she had expanded with seeds provided by his head gardener. His expression as he approached held an animation she had never before witnessed, and in his gloved hands he clutched a leather portfolio with evident excitement. The solicitor had unearthed county records confirming that Blackwood Farm had indeed belonged to Eleanor's grandfather, William Reed Sr., before being seized through legally questionable means during a banking crisis 30 years earlier. The documents suggested collusion between the creditors and the previous Earl of Westmoreland, the current Duke's uncle, to acquire properties at a fraction of their value when owners fell into financial difficulty. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reviewed the evidence that validated what her father had always believed, that his family had been victims of opportunism rather than their own financial mismanagement. When she raised her eyes to the Duke's face, she was startled to find not the reluctant acknowledgement she had expected, but genuine pleasure at being able to deliver this vindication. What happened next would forever alter the course of Eleanor's life. Without preamble, Lord Blackwood stated his intention not merely to return the property to her legal ownership, but to restore both the house and the Reed family name to their former standing. When Eleanor protested that she had no means to properly maintain such a property, even if it were returned to her, the Duke fell uncharacteristically silent, his usually confident demeanor giving way to an almost boyish hesitation. After several moments of palpable tension, he expressed with careful formality that he had come to admire her character greatly and would consider it an honor if she might consider a union that would secure her future while bringing much-needed warmth back to his own existence. The proposal, delivered without flowery sentiments but with profound sincerity, left Eleanor momentarily speechless. This man who had initially threatened to evict them was now offering marriage, a development so unexpected that she could scarcely comprehend its implications. Their quiet moment of mutual vulnerability was shattered by the arrival of an elegant carriage bearing Lady Victoria and two prominent society matrons, come to persuade the Duke to attend an upcoming ball where several eligible young ladies would be presented. The women's shocked expressions upon finding Lord Blackwood in earnest conversation with the shabby occupant of the farmhouse spoke volumes about the social chasm Eleanor would face should she accept his proposal. Victoria's cutting remarks about fortune hunters and appropriate connections were clearly intended to remind the Duke of his position and obligations. To Eleanor's surprise and the lady's evident consternation, Lord Blackwood responded with cold authority that Miss Reed was the rightful owner of Blackwood Farm and would be treated with appropriate respect by all who valued his good opinion. As the unwelcome visitors departed in confused disarray, Eleanor found herself facing a decision she had never imagined possible: to accept a proposal born perhaps of guilt and obligation, to decline and maintain her precarious independence, or to suggest an alternative that might allow them both time to determine whether their unexpected connection could withstand the inevitable opposition of society. The expression in Lord Blackwood's eyes as he awaited her response revealed a vulnerability that the formidable Duke had likely not shown another living soul since his wife's death. In that unguarded moment, Eleanor recognized that whatever his initial motivations might have been, James Blackwood was now a man standing on the edge of an emotional precipice, having offered not just security, but his closely guarded heart to a woman society deemed utterly beneath his notice. The realization that she held such power over this powerful man was both terrifying and exhilarating, forcing Eleanor to examine her own carefully protected emotions and consider whether she too might be brave enough to risk disappointment once again. Eleanor's measured response to the Duke's proposal reflected both her practical nature and her unwillingness to enter any arrangement without complete clarity. She would not accept his offer immediately, she explained in steady tones, though her quickened pulse betrayed emotions she struggled to contain. Instead, she requested time to determine whether his proposal stemmed from genuine affection or merely from guilt over his uncle's role in her family's downfall. More importantly, she needed him to consider fully what bringing someone of her station into his world would mean. The society that had always bowed to his title would not show such deference to a professor's daughter, regardless of her restored property rights. If he found himself regretting his choice when faced with the inevitable whispers and cutting remarks, the consequences would devastate not only her but also her dependent aunt. Lord Blackwood had listened with unexpected patience, his expression softening as she spoke. Rather than appearing offended by her hesitation, he seemed to appreciate the thoughtful consideration behind it. Before departing that evening, he had made an unprecedented suggestion. He would host a dinner at Westmoreland Manor in 1 week's time, to which Eleanor and Aunt Margaret would be formally invited as honoured guests. This event would serve dual purposes: to introduce Eleanor to his closest family associates before rumours could spread, and to announce the restoration of Blackwood Farm to its rightful owners, regardless of her decision regarding his proposal. The following days passed in a blur of activity that left Eleanor little time to contemplate the monumental change in her circumstances. A seamstress arrived from the village with instructions to create appropriate evening attire for both Reed women, while the Duke's personal physician made daily visits to ensure Aunt Margaret would be strong enough to attend the gathering. Even more surprising was the arrival of Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper from Westmoreland Manor, ostensibly to help prepare Eleanor for the social expectations of the evening, but clearly also to evaluate this unusual young woman who had captured her employer's attention. Under the older woman's watchful eye, Eleanor practiced the formal table manners and social protocols expected in ducal circles, skills her academic father had never thought to teach his daughter. To Mrs. Winter's evident surprise, Eleanor proved a quick study, her natural intelligence allowing her to absorb complex social rules with the same facility she had once applied to her father's scholarly texts. What truly won the housekeeper's grudging approval, however, was witnessing Eleanor's gentle care for her aunt and her complete lack of calculation or design in her interactions with the Duke during his daily visits. The evening of the dinner arrived with inexorable swiftness, bringing with it anxieties Eleanor had never before experienced. The gown the seamstress had created, a deep emerald silk that highlighted her clear complexion and brought warmth to her intelligent eyes, was far finer than anything she had ever worn, yet she felt like an imposter as the Duke's carriage delivered them to the imposing facade of Westmoreland Manor. The grandeur of the entrance hall alone exceeded anything in Eleanor's experience, its marble floors and soaring ceilings designed explicitly to intimidate those of lesser rank. Yet Lord Blackwood himself stood waiting at the foot of the grand staircase, his tall figure striking in formal evening attire. The warmth in his eyes as they met hers provided an anchor in this unfamiliar sea, as did the genuine respect with which he greeted Aunt Margaret, personally escorting the elderly woman to a comfortable chair positioned near the fire in the drawing room, where several guests already awaited their host's arrival. The assembled company represented the Duke's closest connections: his younger sister, Lady Elizabeth, and her husband, Lord Pembroke, his cousin, Lord Richard Sheffield, notably unaccompanied by his sister Victoria, his solicitor, Mr. Harrington, and his wife, and two elderly aunts whose approval carried significant weight in society circles. Their initial reactions to Eleanor ranged from polite curiosity to poorly concealed skepticism, particularly from the elder Lady Sheffield, who examined Eleanor through her lorgnette with undisguised disapproval. Conversation during the elaborate meal that followed felt like navigating a battlefield strewn with verbal traps, as seemingly innocent questions about Eleanor's background and education carried barbed implications about her suitability for the company in which she found herself. Yet with each carefully considered response, Eleanor demonstrated the substance behind her quiet dignity. When Lord Richard condescendingly expressed surprise at her familiarity with classical literature, she responded not with defensive pride, but with genuine enthusiasm for the works that had sustained her through difficult times, inadvertently revealing a depth of education that exceeded that of many in the room. As the evening progressed, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. Lady Elizabeth, initially reserved, engaged Eleanor in increasingly genuine conversation about her brother's estate, while Mr. Harrington found himself impressed by her astute questions regarding the legal restoration of Blackwood Farm. Even the formidable Lady Sheffield was observed nodding with reluctant approval when Eleanor gently corrected a historical inaccuracy in the conversation without embarrassing the gentleman who had misspoken. Throughout the meal, Eleanor remained acutely aware of Lord Blackwood's gaze repeatedly seeking hers across the table, his expression revealing both pride in her composure and concern for her comfort. The true test of the evening, however, still awaited as the dinner concluded, and the company returned to the drawing-room, where the Duke had announced his intention to address them all regarding a matter of some importance. Eleanor's heart pounded painfully against her ribs as she took her place beside her aunt, knowing that whatever Lord Blackwood chose to reveal would irrevocably alter the course of her life. The drawing-room of Westmoreland Manor fell into an expectant hush as the Duke moved to stand before the ornate marble fireplace, his commanding presence drawing all eyes. Eleanor felt the weight of those same gazes shift to her as Lord Blackwood began speaking, his deep voice carrying easily through the elegant space. He recounted with remarkable candor the circumstances of his acquisition of Blackwood Farm and his subsequent discovery of its rightful ownership, sparing neither his uncle's reputation nor his own initial reaction to finding Eleanor and her aunt in residence. The assembled guests listened with expressions ranging from shock to fascination as he detailed the legal investigation that had confirmed the Reed family's claim to the property. When he formally announced his intention to restore the farm to Eleanor as its legitimate heir, the reaction was immediate. Lady Sheffield's indignant gasp competed with Mr. Harrington's murmured legal observations and Lord Richard's poorly concealed disapproval. Through it all, Eleanor maintained the composed exterior that had become her armor in a lifetime of challenges, though beneath her calm facade, emotions warred between vindication and acute awareness of the social disapproval now directed her way. What came next, however, left even Eleanor unprepared. Lord Blackwood continued speaking, his tone shifting from formal declaration to something more personal as he addressed his assembled family and friends. The time had come, he stated with quiet intensity, to acknowledge that his prolonged period of grief had evolved into a self-imposed isolation that served neither his future nor his responsibilities to his title and estates. His unexpected encounter with Miss Reed had reminded him that true strength lay not in emotional detachment, but in the courage to recognize worth regardless of its source. The Duke's gaze found Eleanor's across the room as he spoke these words, communicating a depth of feeling that transcended the formal language propriety demanded. When he finally stated with unmistakable clarity that he had asked for Miss Eleanor Reed's hand in marriage and awaited her response, the resulting silence was absolute. Every eye in the room fixed upon the young woman in the emerald gown, whose social elevation from destitute orphan to potential duchess represented a disruption to the natural order that few in that company had ever contemplated. The silence shattered as multiple voices erupted simultaneously. Lady Sheffield declared such a match utterly inappropriate given Eleanor's lack of family connections, while Lord Richard questioned with barely concealed contempt whether Miss Reed had somehow manipulated the situation to her advantage. Even the kindly Lady Elizabeth expressed concern about the challenges her brother would face in society should he proceed with such an unconventional choice. Through this barrage, Lord Blackwood remained standing before the fireplace, his expression hardening into the formidable mask that had intimidated countless society members over the years. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a steel that silenced even his most vocal critics. The question of Miss Reed's suitability, he stated coldly, revealed more about those raising such concerns than about the lady herself. Any person who valued wealth and connection above character and intelligence was welcome to excuse themselves from his acquaintance permanently, as he had no desire to maintain relationships with those incapable of recognizing true worth when it stood before them. In the stunned silence that followed this unprecedented declaration, Eleanor rose slowly from her seat beside her aunt. All eyes tracked her movement as she crossed the expanse of Persian carpet to stand before Lord Blackwood, her simple dignity in stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. The words she spoke were intended for him alone, yet in the hushed room they carried to every straining ear. She had indeed reached a decision regarding his proposal, she told him, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. The past weeks had shown her not merely the Duke of Westmoreland with all his power and position, but James Blackwood the man, a man of integrity who had chosen right action over convenience, compassion over pride, and truth over comfortable falsehood. It was to this man, not to his title, that she now gave her answer. Yes, she would marry him, not for the security his position offered, but for the partnership his character promised. As she spoke these words, the transformation in Lord Blackwood's expression was remarkable to all who witnessed it. The reserved, often forbidding countenance gave way to a smile of such genuine joy that several guests later confessed to barely recognizing the austere Duke in that moment of unguarded happiness. What happened next would be recounted in society circles for years to come. Lord James Blackwood, the 7th Duke of Westmoreland, a man known for his rigid adherence to propriety and disdain for public displays of emotion, took Eleanor's hands in his and raised them to his lips in a gesture of profound reverence. Then, before his assembled family and closest acquaintances, he spoke words that none present had ever expected to hear from his lips. He thanked her, not only for accepting his proposal but for awakening him from the half-life he had endured since Catherine's death. The woman he had lost would always remain in his heart, he acknowledged, but Eleanor had shown him that honoring that memory did not require sacrificing his future happiness. As he spoke these deeply personal words without shame or hesitation, a remarkable shift occurred among the witnesses. Lady Elizabeth wiped tears from her eyes before approaching to embrace the woman who had inspired such transformation in her beloved brother. Mr. Harrington raised his glass in sincere toast, while even the formidable Lady Sheffield was observed to press her handkerchief suspiciously to her eyes, before announcing with sudden decisiveness that she would personally oversee preparations for a wedding befitting the Duke of Westmoreland. In the space of a single evening, Eleanor Reed, the professor's daughter who had occupied an abandoned farmhouse out of desperate necessity, had been transformed in society's eyes from an inappropriate interloper to the woman who had accomplished what many had thought impossible. She had restored life and warmth to the frozen heart of Lord James Blackwood. News of the Duke of Westmoreland's engagement to an unknown professor's daughter spread through London society with the speed and force of a summer thunderstorm. In drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs throughout Mayfair, speculation ran rampant about the mysterious Miss Reed, who had somehow captured the interest of England's most eligible and unapproachable widower. The story gained increasingly dramatic embellishments with each retelling. She had been discovered living like a gypsy on his property. She had bewitched him with mysterious potions. She was secretly related to foreign royalty. None of these fantastical tales approached the simple truth that in Eleanor's quiet strength and uncompromising integrity, Lord Blackwood had recognized qualities far more valuable than the social advantages and connections that had previously been considered essential for a duchess. As preparations for the wedding proceeded, Lady Victoria Sheffield mounted a determined campaign to discredit the bride-to-be, circulating rumors about Eleanor's background and suggesting impropriety in her initial occupation of Blackwood Farm. These efforts gained little traction, however, once the true legal circumstances of the property's history became known, particularly when several other landowners came forward with similar stories of the previous Earl's questionable acquisition practices, lending credence to Eleanor's claim and the Duke's decision to restore the property. Eleanor herself remained largely sheltered from this social tumult, dividing her time between overseeing renovations at Blackwood Farm and becoming acquainted with the responsibilities that awaited her as the future Duchess of Westmoreland. Under Lady Elizabeth's surprisingly warm guidance, she was gradually introduced to the extensive charitable works traditionally managed by the Duke's wife, finding particular satisfaction in a program that provided educational opportunities for the children of estate workers. Lord Blackwood, meanwhile, discovered himself increasingly drawn to Blackwood Farm, where the simple farmhouse kitchen still provided a space of genuine conversation and connection unlike anything in his grand manor. On more than one occasion, the formidable Duke was observed by astonished servants sitting at the worn kitchen table, his formal attire discarded in favor of shirt sleeves as he listened to Eleanor read aloud or engaged in spirited debate about literature and philosophy. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable to all who had known him during the dark years following his first wife's death. The cold reserve had given way to an engaged presence, and servants reported hearing the Duke laugh for the first time in memory. 3 weeks before the wedding, an unexpected visitor arrived at Blackwood Farm where Eleanor was supervising the planting of a medicinal herb garden based on her aunt's knowledge. Lady Catherine's mother, the Dowager Countess of Harrington, had journeyed from her estate in Scotland specifically to meet the woman who was to become the second wife of her beloved son-in-law. Initial tension gave way to genuine connection as the elderly woman observed Eleanor's practical nature and evident affection for Lord Blackwood. During a private moment in the garden, the Countess revealed that she had brought something she believed Eleanor should have, a small portrait of Catherine that had travelled with the first Duchess everywhere during her brief marriage. Rather than exhibiting jealousy or discomfort, Eleanor received this gift with sincere gratitude, recognizing it as both approval and acknowledgement that Catherine would always remain an important part of the Duke's life and legacy. When Lord Blackwood arrived later that afternoon to find his former mother-in-law and his fiancée in comfortable conversation about the planned renovations to the family wing of Westmoreland Manor, his expression of stunned relief was noted by both women with knowing smiles. The wedding ceremony itself struck a careful balance between the grandeur expected for a man of the Duke's position and the more modest preferences of the bride. St. George's Church in London was filled with aristocracy and political figures whose attendance was motivated as much by curiosity as by genuine goodwill, yet the front pews held those whose presence truly mattered to the couple. Aunt Margaret, supported by her nurse, the Dowager Countess, Lady Elizabeth and her family, and several former colleagues of Professor Reed who had travelled considerable distances to witness his daughter's unexpected eleva. Tyon, Eleanor entered the church on the arm of her father's oldest friend, Professor Hamilton, wearing a gown whose elegant simplicity reflected her own character rather than the ostentation typically displayed at aristocratic weddings. The collective intake of breath that greeted her appearance had little to do with the modest grandeur of her attire, and everything to do with the transformation evident in the woman herself, the quiet dignity that had sustained her through hardship, now illuminated by genuine happiness as her gaze met that of the waiting Duke. Lord Blackwood, standing tall and imposing before the altar, maintained his customary serious expression until the moment Eleanor began her procession toward him. Then, in full view of London's most influential citizens, the facade crumbled to reveal naked emotion that none save his closest family had witnessed in the 7 years since he had last stood at this same altar. Perhaps the most remarked-upon moment of the ceremony came not during the exchange of vows, but during Lord Blackwood's unexpected addition to the traditional service. Before placing the ring upon Eleanor's finger, he spoke directly to her in a voice that carried throughout the hushed church. He thanked her publicly for showing him that true nobility had nothing to do with titles or bloodlines, and everything to do with the courage to face adversity with dignity and to recognize worth regardless of its origins. In choosing to honor these qualities through marriage, he continued, he was not bestowing a favor, but acknowledging the extraordinary gift he had received in finding someone who valued the man rather than the Duke. As he spoke these words, numerous handkerchiefs appeared throughout the congregation, and several gentlemen were observed to clear their throats repeatedly. The Archbishop himself, a man not given to sentimentality, later commented that in 40 years of performing aristocratic marriages, he had never witnessed such genuine emotion or heard such sincere vows. Lady Victoria, seated in a back pew and wearing an expression of profound displeasure, found herself increasingly isolated as the social tide turned decisively in favor of the new Duchess, whose composure and evident sincerity had won over even the most skeptical observers of this unprecedented match. The grandest social test for the new Duchess of Westmoreland came 6 weeks after the wedding, when tradition dictated that the couple host their first formal ball at Westmoreland Manor. This event would mark Eleanor's official introduction to the highest echelons of society as the Duke's wife rather than merely his controversial fiancée. The guest list included royalty, politicians, and the most influential families in England, many of whom had openly questioned the suitability of the match. Eleanor approached this challenge with characteristic thoroughness, working closely with the Manor's long-serving staff to ensure every detail reflected both the dignity of the Westmoreland title and her own more progressive sensibilities. The traditional ostentation was balanced by thoughtful touches, locally sourced flowers, arranged with natural elegance rather than imported blooms forced into artificial displays, menu selections that showcased the produce of tenant farmers, musical choices that included not only the expected classical pieces, but also folk melodies that honored the regional heritage of the estate. These decisions raised eyebrows among the more conventional members of the household staff, until Mrs. Winters, now Eleanor's staunchest ally, reminded them that their new mistress had restored lightness to the once somber halls and genuine purpose to charitable endeavors that had become mere formalities under the Duke's solitary management. On the evening of the ball, Eleanor stood at the entrance of the ballroom beside her husband, receiving hundreds of guests whose curiosity was poorly concealed behind practiced social smiles. Her gown, a creation of silver silk that emphasized her slender figure while maintaining appropriate dignity for her position, had been specifically designed to include subtle elements that honored both Catherine's memory and her own heritage. The sapphire necklace that had belonged to the first Duchess was complemented by lace trim created by women from the village near Blackwood Farm, now thriving under Eleanor's patronage. Lord Blackwood remained at his wife's side throughout the receiving line, his protective stance and occasional proud glances communicating clearly that any slight to the Duchess would be considered a personal affront to the Duke himself. This unspoken warning proved largely unnecessary as the evening progressed, for Eleanor's natural intelligence and the quiet confidence she had developed since her marriage enabled her to navigate even the most challenging social interactions with unexpected grace. When Lady Victoria deliberately attempted to embarrass her by loudly referencing her former poverty within earshot of several influential matrons, Eleanor neither flinched nor responded in kind, instead acknowledging with simple dignity that her experiences had taught her to value substance over superficial advantages, a lesson she hoped to apply in her new role, supporting the Duke's many responsibilities toward those dependent on his estates. The defining moment of the evening occurred shortly before midnight, when tradition dictated that the Duke and Duchess open the dancing with a waltz. As Lord Blackwood led Eleanor onto the floor, the assembled guests fell silent, many remembering his notorious refusal to dance in the years following Catherine's death. The orchestra began the opening notes of a Viennese waltz, and those closest to the dance floor observed something remarkable in the Duke's expression as he took his wife in his arms. The last traces of the grief-hardened man had vanished, replaced by a look of such tender regard that several older ladies were moved to tears at the transformation. Eleanor, who had practiced diligently for weeks under Lady Elizabeth's tutelage, moved with natural grace that belied her lack of formal training. As they circled the floor in perfect harmony, whispers spread through the watching crowd. Not malicious speculation, but genuine recognition that something extraordinary had occurred. The professor's daughter, initially dismissed as an inappropriate choice, had accomplished what a dozen aristocratic beauties had failed to achieve. She had brought genuine happiness to the Duke of Westmoreland, not by conforming to society's expectations, but by remaining true to the authentic character that had first captured his attention. As the ball continued into the early hours of the morning, a subtle but significant shift occurred in the dynamics of the gathering. Those who had come merely to satisfy their curiosity about the mismatched couple found themselves genuinely impressed by Eleanor's thoughtful conversation and unpretentious dignity. Several of the Duke's oldest friends, who had maintained polite distance since his first wife's death, approached him with evident pleasure at finding him restored to something resembling his younger self. Most telling was the moment when the prince himself, having observed the interactions throughout the evening, commented within hearing of several influential guests that Westmoreland had shown remarkable wisdom in selecting a wife of substance rather than merely advantageous connections. By the time the last carriages departed in the pale light of dawn, the consensus among the departing guests had shifted decisively. The unconventional Duchess might lack the polished artifice of her predecessors, but her genuine intelligence and evident positive influence on the Duke more than compensated for any deficiencies in lineage or fortune. Lady Victoria, having failed in her campaign to undermine Eleanor's position, departed early, with the bitter realization that her own calculating ambitions appeared shallow and self-serving when contrasted with the authentic connection now evident between her cousin and his chosen bride. In the quiet aftermath of their first social triumph as husband and wife, Eleanor and Lord Blackwood retreated not to their formal chambers, but to the small library that had become their private sanctuary within the vast manor. There, with the formality of their public roles temporarily set aside, James expressed what he had been unable to say amid the watching eyes of society, that in presenting her to his world this evening, he had felt not the obligation he had anticipated, but genuine pride in the woman who now shared his name and his life. Eleanor, still processing the remarkable journey that had brought her from desperate occupant of an abandoned farmhouse to mistress of one of England's greatest estates, confessed her lingering amazement at the transformation in her circumstances. Yet what truly mattered, she told her husband with characteristic honesty, was not the material change, but the emotional one. The discovery that behind the forbidding facade of the Duke existed a man of profound integrity and unexpected tenderness, a man she had come to love not for his position, but for his essential character. As dawn light filtered through the library windows, illuminating their private moment of connection amid the aftermath of public display, both recognized how completely their unexpected encounter had altered not just their individual lives, but their understanding of what truly constituted value in this world that placed such emphasis on external markers of worth. The first year of marriage brought changes to both Westmoreland Manor and Blackwood Farm that reflected the harmonious union of their respective owners. Under Eleanor's thoughtful guidance, the imposing ducal residence gradually shed some of its forbidding grandeur, with previously shuttered rooms open to light and austere formal spaces softened by thoughtfully selected furnishings that prioritized comfort without sacrificing elegance. The Duke's extensive library, once his solitary retreat, became a shared sanctuary where husband and wife often spent evenings engaged in reading and conversation that ranged from estate management to philosophy. Blackwood Farm, meanwhile, underwent extensive renovation that preserved its essential character while making it a comfortable retreat when the couple sought respite from the demands of their public position. The property that had once stood abandoned now flourished as a working farm that implemented progressive agricultural methods researched by Eleanor and supported by her husband's resources. Most significantly, the small cottage on the edge of the farm, originally the gamekeeper's residence, was converted into a school for local children, with particular emphasis on providing educational opportunities for girls who would otherwise receive only the most rudimentary instruction. When questioned about this unconventional project, the Duchess would explain with quiet conviction that her own father's belief in her intellectual capabilities had been her greatest inheritance, one she hoped to extend to children regardless of their social station. Within the wider social sphere, initial skepticism about the unconventional Duchess gradually gave way to genuine respect as Eleanor navigated her new responsibilities with natural dignity and surprising effectiveness. Her management of the Duke's charitable endeavors introduced practical reforms that maximized their impact rather than merely maintaining tradition, while her genuine interest in the welfare of estate workers and their families earned loyalty that translated into unprecedented productivity across Westmoreland's holdings. Even more remarkable was the subtle influence she exercised on her husband's political positions. Lord Blackwood, who had previously approached parliamentary matters with detached pragmatism, now brought passionate advocacy to issues of educational reform and fair treatment of agricultural workers, positions directly influenced by Eleanor's perspective and experiences. This evolution in the Duke's public stance initially raised eyebrows among his peers, but the thoughtful articulation of his arguments, combined with demonstrable success of similar approaches on his own estates, gradually won converts even among the most conservative members of the House of Lords. Lady Victoria, who had continued attempts to undermine the marriage through subtle social maneuvers, found herself increasingly isolated, as prominent hostesses recognized the advantage of securing the now sought-after Duchess for their guest lists, where her unconventional insights and refreshing lack of artifice enlivened previously predictable conversations. Perhaps the most significant test of the relationship came 10 months into the marriage, when Eleanor discovered she was expecting a child. The news brought both joy and underlying tension, as the Duke's first wife had died in childbirth along with their infant son, a tragedy that had shaped 7 years of his life. The shadow of this past loss manifested in Lord Blackwood's barely concealed anxiety. As the pregnancy progressed, his increased protectiveness occasionally bordering on suffocation as he sought to prevent history from repeating itself. Eleanor met this challenge with characteristic empathy and firmness, acknowledging his fears while refusing to be treated as a fragile invalid. When his protective instincts threatened to become excessive, she gently reminded him that her own mother had borne 3 children with no complications, and that modern medical understanding had advanced significantly in the years since Catherine's death. Most importantly, she helped him articulate the guilt that had remained unresolved in his grief, the irrational but persistent belief that he had somehow failed to protect his first wife by being absent when complications arose. Through countless conversations in the privacy of their chambers, Eleanor gradually guided her husband toward acceptance that the past tragedy had been beyond his control and that their current happiness deserved to be embraced without the constant shadow of anticipated loss. As Eleanor's condition advanced, Lord Blackwood insisted on bringing the most respected physician in London to reside at Westmoreland Manor, while Eleanor herself arranged for the local midwife from the village near Blackwood Farm, a woman with 30 years practical experience, to join the household staff. This practical compromise between aristocratic resources and common sense characterized many of their joint decisions and contributed significantly to the growing reputation of their marriage as an unusual but effective partnership. The Dowager Countess of Harrington, who had become a frequent and welcome visitor, observed with evident approval how the expectant couple balanced traditional preparations with practical innovations that prioritized the health of both mother and child. Most touching to those close to the family was the Duke's decision to renovate the long-closed family nursery, personally selecting furnishings while ensuring that the portrait of Catherine that Eleanor had received before their wedding was given a place of honor on the wall. This gesture, undertaken without prompting, demonstrated more eloquently than words how completely healing had transformed grief into a capacity for honoring the past while fully embracing the present. On a bright morning in early spring, precisely 13 months after their first meeting at the abandoned farmhouse, the Duke of Westmoreland paced the corridor outside the birthing chamber where Eleanor labored to bring their child into the world. Despite the reassurances of both physician and midwife that all was progressing normally, James found himself torn between respect for his wife's explicit instruction that he maintain his composure and the nearly overwhelming fear of losing the woman who had become essential to his existence. After hours that seemed endless, the cry of a newborn finally pierced the tense silence, followed shortly by the midwife's appearance with news that both mother and daughter were healthy and waiting to receive him. The emotion that overcame the formidable Duke as he first beheld his exhausted but radiant wife cradling their infant daughter was witnessed only by the attending medical staff, who later remarked that they had never seen such a transformation in human countenance, from terror to wonder in the space of a heartbeat. When Eleanor placed the tiny girl in her father's arms and suggested they name her Catherine Eleanor, honoring both the past and the present in a single gesture, those present observed the completion of a healing journey that had begun the day a proud, grief-hardened Duke had discovered 2 women occupying his abandoned farmhouse. In that moment of perfect connection between past loss and present joy, the extraordinary partnership that had scandalized and then captivated London society revealed its true foundation, not merely romantic attachment, but profound mutual understanding and respect that transcended conventional expectations of marriage at any level of society. 5 years passed, transforming Blackwood Farm from a forgotten property to a thriving estate that served as both working farm and frequent retreat for the Duke's growing family. Little Catherine, now joined by a 3-year-old brother named William James after both grandfathers, delighted in the freedom of country life, racing through meadows, helping gather eggs from the hen house, and sitting wide-eyed as her great-aunt Margaret shared herbal wisdom and family stories. The elderly woman, whose health had flourished under Eleanor's care and the joy of the children's presence, had become the living repository of Reed family history, ensuring that the children understood both sides of their heritage. On this particular spring afternoon, remarkably similar to the day when Eleanor and James had first encountered one another, The Duchess sat on a blanket spread beneath the ancient oak tree that shaded the garden, watching her husband attempt to explain the rudiments of horseback riding to their daughter. The sight of the once forbidding Duke of Westmoreland patiently answering the endless questions of a precocious 5-year-old, his formal demeanor completely absent as he demonstrated proper posture on a docile pony, still occasionally struck Eleanor as miraculous evidence of how profoundly life could change through unexpected circumstances. As little William toddled toward her with a freshly picked dandelion clutched in his chubby hand, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey from desperate occupation of an abandoned farmhouse to this moment of complete contentment. Westmoreland Manor remained their primary residence and the center of their social and political responsibilities, but its character had evolved as significantly as its master over the years of Eleanor's influence. The school established at Blackwood Farm had proven so successful that similar institutions had been established on 3 other Westmoreland properties, with curricula designed to provide practical education alongside academic foundations for children who would previously have received minimal schooling. These initiatives, initially regarded with skepticism by neighboring landowners, had gradually gained support as their benefits became evident in increased prosperity and stability throughout the communities they served. The Duke, once known primarily for his wealth and remote demeanor, had become one of the most effective advocates for educational reform in Parliament, while Eleanor's practical approach to charitable endeavours had transformed numerous traditional ladies' committees from social exercises into genuinely effective organisations. Most remarkably, the partnership that had once shocked society had become a model frequently cited when traditional arrangements based solely on advantage proved hollow and unfulfilling. Young ladies who might previously have accepted matches based entirely on status now occasionally dared to suggest that perhaps the Duke and Duchess of Westmoreland had demonstrated a better foundation for marriage, mutual respect and genuine affection rather than merely advantageous connection. Lady Victoria Sheffield, whose attempts to undermine Eleanor had eventually ceased from sheer ineffectiveness, had married a wealthy but untitled industrialist whose resources had rescued her family's dwindling fortunes. The irony that she had ultimately made a match that crossed traditional social boundaries, the very thing she had criticized in Eleanor's case, was not lost on London society, though few dared mention it in her presence. More satisfying to Eleanor was the genuine friendship that had developed between herself and Lady Elizabeth, whose initial concerns about her brother's unconventional choice had given way to profound gratitude for the happiness and purpose Eleanor had restored to his life. The Pembroke estate now adjoined one of the Westmoreland educational projects, with Elizabeth herself taking an active role in its management and frequently seeking Eleanor's counsel on matters ranging from curriculum development to navigating the still considerable social resistance to progressive ideas about women's capabilities. The circle of those who accepted and valued the Duchess for her character rather than her title had gradually expanded to include many who had initially judged her harshly, creating a social environment where genuine conversation often replaced superficial exchange during gatherings at Westmoreland Manor. The most profound change, however, was evident in Lord Blackwood himself. The man who had once moved through life encased in grief and duty now approached each day with engaged purpose and genuine enjoyment. His relationship with Eleanor had deepened beyond the initial attraction of opposites into a partnership of equals who brought complementary strengths to their shared responsibilities. In Parliament and in management of his extensive business interests, James had come to value his wife's perspective as essential to fully understanding complex situations, often remarking that her background provided insights unavailable to those whose experience had been limited to privilege. Eleanor, meanwhile, had developed confidence in navigating the aristocratic world without compromising her essential values, using her position to advocate for those whose voices would otherwise remain unheard in the halls of power. Together, they had created not merely a successful marriage, but a genuinely integrated life that honored both their disparate origins while creating something new and valuable from their union. The abandoned farmhouse that had once represented Eleanor's desperate circumstances had been transformed, much like its occupants, into a place of flourishing life and unexpected possibility. As the afternoon light began to fade, The Duke lifted his drowsy son into his arms, while Catherine skipped ahead on the path leading back to the farmhouse, chattering excitedly about tomorrow's planned expedition to collect wildflower specimens for her botanist's journal. Eleanor gathered the remains of their picnic, pausing to look back at the ancient oak tree that had witnessed so much of their story. From the desperate days of initial occupation through confrontation, growing understanding, and finally the deep contentment of their current life. James caught her gaze and extended his free hand, the gesture communicating years of shared experience and understanding that transcended words. As she placed her hand in his, Eleanor thought of the countless young women throughout England who faced circumstances similar to those she had encountered. Limited options, social dismissal, and desperate choices made from necessity rather than preference. If her unlikely journey from destitute orphan to duchess served any greater purpose, she reflected, perhaps it was to demonstrate that true value existed independent of social position, and that those who recognized this truth might find happiness in the most unexpected places. Dear listener, as the sun sets on Blackwood Farm and the Duke and Duchess walk hand in hand toward the home that once represented such different things to each of them, consider what unexpected treasures might await in the challenging circumstances of your own life. The abandoned farmhouses of our experience, those situations that appear to offer only hardship and limitation, sometimes contain the very connections that will transform our understanding of what truly matters. Eleanor Reed's journey from desperate trespasser to beloved Duchess reminds us that the measure of a person lies not in their social position or material advantages, but in the courage, integrity, and capacity for love they bring to life's unexpected encounters. The most imposing facades, like that of the grief-hardened Duke, may conceal hearts capable of profound connection when finally given permission to emerge. And the most seemingly insignificant beginnings, like finding shelter in an abandoned house, may lead to journeys beyond our wildest imaginings when we face each challenge with dignity and remain true to our essential character. In the unexpected intersections of our lives, we may discover not merely survival, but the profound joy of being truly seen and valued for who we authentically are.